So I'm going to invite up our president and CEO, Brent Phillips. Let's give him a round of applause. One of the things that we've been doing in getting people to come and speak and to be part of an interview session is really just, knowing different stories and asking. And it has been such a blessing that for everyone that I have asked, they have said absolutely yes. And it involves sharing from an intimate place, because then I start asking for pictures. And then I start saying, this picture isn't good enough. I start asking for things, and it gets a little bit, almost, you want to get inside of their homes and their lives and their personal being. And so thank you so much for being a part and for being willing to share your story and for allowing us to have, to get inside the other aspect of your life, not your life as the president and CEO, but your life as a husband, a father, a son, a brother, a relative. And so thank you for that. And a man who's traveled and done mission work. Thank you for allowing us to have this time with you. So I'll have you say a little thing, whatever you want to say about yourself as we get started.
Well, I'm just incredibly excited to be here and share a little bit about myself and my family and my journey up to this point in my life. And hopefully we won't talk a lot about work. We'll talk about other things, and we'll go from there.
So tell us about your childhood.
So I grew up a poor white boy. Let me just start there. I grew up on a dairy farm in Idaho. I'm the oldest of 9 kids, and we were incredibly poor. I didn't realize we were poor growing up until I left home and, looking back, realized how poor we were. But I didn't know we were poor at the time. There was an incredible amount of love in our home, like I'm sure there was in lots of homes. This picture actually is my family, all 9 of us kids, and my parents. I grew up learning hard work. We had a dairy farm, and we had 60 cows, and I'm 14 in that picture, and when I was 13, I took over responsibility of our family dairies, so it was a year before that picture. So I'd get up at 4:30 and milk our 60 cows before I would go to school. And then, and my younger brother, who's sitting next to me here, David, I would get him to come with me and help. But he was pretty worthless. He turned out okay, but he was pretty worthless at the time. He was about 10. So the 2 of us, and the reason it was age 13 is because I had a driver's license at 13. And the dairy was about 4 miles away from where I grew up. And my dad would have responsibility for the farm, and I had responsibility for the dairy. And the reason is my grandfather retired, so he taught me from about age 11 how to milk the cows. And then at 13, when I had a driver's license, he said, I'm now done milking. You have a driver's license. You're now in charge. And it was a bit like the first time you get to mow the lawn, you think that's pretty cool, and then you realize you now are in charge of mowing the lawn, and it's not quite as cool. And so I got that task.
And so you were working on the dairy farm, and then from there you went off to college. Tell us a little bit about that.
I was excited to go to college. My parents encouraged all of us kids to go to college. And I was somewhat of a pioneer. Ended up graduating college. It was actually the first from either my dad's side or my mother's side to graduate from college. We didn't have a lot of money. As I mentioned, my parents were able to give me $1,000 and a good luck. I did have a leadership scholarship to go to college. I'd been student body president in our high school and some other leadership activities, which was very helpful, but needed to secure jobs when I went to college. And so I cleaned boys' dorms because I could secure that job because it was at 3 a.m. and nobody else wanted that job. And so all I was giving up is sleep. So I would clean boys' dorms at 3 a.m. and I could still make class at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And then tutor classes in the afternoon and work as a jailer at 11 o'clock at night on Friday night until 11 o'clock at night on Saturday at the county jail. taking care of inmates, again, a job that nobody else wanted, just to make ends meet. And that's just the way it was, right? It was hard work, but it was just the way it was. So you could get done what you had to do.
And with you doing all this work and working so hard, you were still able to get your degrees, bachelor's and master's degree in 5.5 years.
Yeah, so I had this burning desire to become a taxpayer really fast. Actually, because I didn't have a lot of money, I needed to finish my schooling as quick as I could. So, finished my master's degree, my undergrad and 2 master's degrees in 5.5 years. So, I was going as quick as I could because I could take as many classes as I could. Tuition was capped. And so we just got it done.
Wow, that's incredible. How many of you can relate to poverty, whether it is personal or you've witnessed it or you were really close to people who were poor? How many of you know what poverty is? Yeah. A lot of us know what poverty is. And every time we have a speaker and we do an interview, we also have the healthcare application. And so when you think about it, more than 40 million Americans live in poverty. And how do we define poverty? If you have a family of 4 with under $24,000 per annum, you're considered to struggle financially, you're considered to be poor. And what people don't realize from what Brent shared is people who work a minimum wage job tend to fall under the poverty line because of the amount of income, and most of them work multiple jobs. So here you're a student, and you were getting up at 3 a.m., working on the weekends. That is what poverty does, is it makes people work if they want to get out of it, but work probably harder than those who've never experienced poverty. How many of you know what I'm talking about? And it takes more work for someone who comes from poverty to get out of it than we can ever imagine. It takes a lot of hard work, and not hard work for 3-4 months, 5.5 years. He was just doing this and going for it, and from the age of 13, running a farm. And so I always like to encourage, when we come across those patients who struggle financially, empathy. They already know they're poor. And so we help them. How can we help with payment collections, payment plans? What can we set up to ensure that we create a win-win situation? The patient gets the care they need, we get the reimbursement that we need, and we create a win-win situation. Wage earners who are suddenly out of work fall into that category. And millions of families everywhere from our cities to rural communities struggle with poverty. It's interesting because when you break poverty down, we use the word ethnicity because we're pulling out Hispanics. Typically, you would say race. When you talk about Native Americans, Black, white, and Asians, we would say race, but we've added Hispanics. And 27.6% of our Native Americans struggle with poverty. 26.2% of Black Americans struggle with poverty. 23.4% of Hispanics struggle with poverty. 12.4% of whites struggle with poverty. And the lowest rate group that have the minimal level of poverty tend to be Asians. So bear that in mind as you interact with people and you deal with people. Understand that there are different levels, and people can be poor, people are poor, and our job is to help them with dignity provide services and to obtain our reimbursement and to create that win-win situation. So let's go back a little bit, because we've talked about you graduating from college. Tell us, before you graduated from college, you took some time out.
I did. So I went to a year of school, and I thought I wanted to be a banker, so I was studying finance, and I took a year off of school and made a decision to be a missionary for 2 years in Africa, and Zimbabwe, actually, which is the highlighted country here. And that experience changed my life. It's the reason that I actually ended up going into healthcare versus banking. And it opened my eyes to lots of things. I saw absolute poverty. You may or may not know, I mean, there are people, if we think we've seen poverty in America, there are people in India that live their entire lives and never have the opportunity to wear clothing. Now that's poverty. There are people in India who live their entire lives who never step foot in a building. Okay, wrap your head around that for poverty. Okay, I didn't even see that level of poverty when I lived in Africa. But I saw incredible poverty in magnitudes different than I had grown up. We always had food. I lived on a farm. So we always had food. We never went hungry. We just didn't go to the movies, right? We didn't go out to dinner. We didn't do things that many of us, even though we may not have a lot of disposable income, we may enjoy luxuries today that I did not enjoy, or maybe we didn't enjoy growing up. But that experience was very interesting. I was very much a minority in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had been through a revolution, a 15-year revolution. It was a white-ruled country, and in 1980 it became a black-ruled country. And so many of the whites had left the country. I was there in 1985 and 1986. And so the politics had changed rather dramatically. I would go weeks and weeks and weeks and never speak to another white person. In fact, I would go oftentimes weeks and almost not see another white person. I'll tell you an interesting story. I was in a village, a small village, and this was sort of a National Geographic scene with grass huts and little kids running around and very small plots of gardens and farms, and the little kids, little small kids, and they would, when they saw us, they ran in terror, literally screaming and running and yelling "Nyoka, Nyoka," and my Shona, which is a native language, was pretty rudimentary, but Nyoka means devil or snake or evil spirit. It means the same thing, and in my belief, snakes and devil and evil spirit mean all the same thing as well. So I had no problem with that. And but they were yelling "Nyoka," and I was looking for the snake, and I didn't see a snake, and I was talking to the lady that I was with, and I said, "What are they referring to?" And she sort of chuckled, and she said, "They're talking about you." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "They're talking about you." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, in our culture, evil spirits are white." Now think about it. In our culture, general culture in America, in the movies, what is an evil spirit is what color? Generally dark, isn't it? Because generally in America, we are light-skinned, so an evil spirit would not be looking like you or me, right? We would have to make an evil spirit look something different. So in Africa, the culture would be the evil spirit would need to look different than me, right? You wouldn't make the evil spirit look like me. So in the Shona culture, the evil spirit is white. These little kids had never seen a white person before. And so their grandmother had been telling them, you need to do your chores or Nyoka is going to come and get you, right?
And then Nyoka finally showed up.
And then I showed up, and these little kids were absolutely freaked out, and Nyoka had finally showed up. Grandma was right. And they were, you can imagine, absolutely petrified. And yeah, but it was a teaching moment, right? It was a teaching moment that you would not have imagined that being white would be equated to a devil, a snake, an evil spirit in someone's culture.
And so here is the healthcare application. What do you see when you see people? What do you see when you see people? You're going to turn to the person next to you and you're going to tell them, when you see people, what do you really see? Do you see the smile first? Do you see the color of the skin? Do you see the attitude? What do you see? So find someone next to you and for 1 minute, really tell them. And if there are areas of improvement that you need to work on, this is an opportunity to come to that realization and to bring unconscious bias to the forefront. So the question we asked last time that we are going to talk about again briefly is exposure to human differences and relationships with diverse people. It helps to break down the fear and the negative stereotypes, because I can presume, Brent, that after they got to know you, they stopped saying Nyoka. but they had to get to know him. So we have all these themes that we've seen, that we've read in our minds, movies we've seen about what scary people look like. And so when you get to know people, really surround yourself, irrigate your life with diversity. I emphasize, no rich people, no poor people, no people with disabilities, people who are in nursing homes forever, people who have had difficulties in their lifetime. Get to know people. If you only know the people that are like you and think like you and act like you and are everything like you, it is to your disadvantage. But the more we get to know people, the more we get to know their situations, and the more we get to preemptively act in appropriate ways. We've talked about conscious and unconscious bias, and we've talked about cultural awareness. And the best place to get to in cultural awareness is when you are unconsciously competent. When you don't have to think about it, you just know how to behave because you're unconsciously competent. It's just natural to you. So that is so important for us. And so you left Africa, Brent, and you came back to the United States, finished your degrees, got, your bachelor's and graduate studies, 5.5 years. And along the line, you met a beautiful lady. So tell us about that.
So I tricked her. Actually, my wife, Kim, we met on a blind date, actually. So it was sort of a trick. So I was in graduate school at the University of Minnesota. My wife was a resident at Mayo Clinic. And we got set up on a blind date by a friend, and it was a double date. And she actually thought she was going out with my friend. So it was a bit of a confusion. She might not have agreed if it was me, but she went out. But we met in a parking lot, she and I, and it was a bad rainstorm. And I pulled in the parking lot, and there was one car, and it was a huge downpour, and I just pulled up next to it and jumped in that car and said, "I hope you're Kim." And thank goodness it was. And we went dancing, believe it or not, which I think that's the only time we've ever went dancing. Surprising I got a second date because I'm not a dancer. So I think that's a good example of a stereotype because through graduate school in healthcare administration, I had a stereotype of physicians being arrogant and maybe all the stereotypes of physicians. And I've met my wife, and she was not all those things. And like a lot of physicians are not. And I didn't believe she was really a physician. Thought she was kidding me.
Because she was nice, and she was decent, and she violated your stereotypes.
She violated my stereotype. So one time I drove down to Mayo Clinic and went up to the dermatology floor and sat in the waiting room and waited to see if, in fact, she was a resident in dermatology. And she really was. And so she was telling me the truth. And so we dated that year, and we got to know each other. And we would see each other only about every 2 or 3 weeks because we lived about 90 minutes apart from each other. And so our relationship grew rather slowly, which was actually good. We were both very busy. And over the course of that first year, probably the first 4 or 5 months, as we started dating, and we both had relationships had girlfriends or boyfriends previous to that. My family, as I'm the oldest, my family back in Idaho would, ask, "Are you dating someone?" or whatever the case may be, or maybe they would call while Kim happened to be at my apartment, my roommate in my apartment. "Oh, who is that?" And I'd say, "Kim." Oh, and they would talk to her on the telephone. "Oh, what does she look like?" Right? And I said, "She's about 5'3" and she has dark hair.
So you never described her as black. You always said she was 5'3" with dark hair.
Right. And I did that for a very specific reason. Because and she would talk to him on the telephone. because I wanted my family to get to know her as a person. In case they would form a stereotype. Now, I don't know if they would have, but in case they would have. And so about 5 months after or maybe even longer actually, no, it was actually shorter, there was the Minnesota State Fair, and I had a brother and a sister that flew out, younger brother and sister, that were in high school. They flew out and went to the State Fair with us. And we went to the State Fair, the four of us, and went home, and they were showing snapshots of being at the State Fair. And that's how my family found out that Kim is black. And my family was like, oh, she's a beautiful young woman, but they knew her at that point. And so what would have happened if I would have said from the very beginning, she's black? In the town I grew up in, there's no African Americans. What would have happened? I don't know. But I made the decision that I wanted my family to get to know her as a person. A little bit like if you introduce someone, I want you to meet my friend. Oh, by the way, they're blind. Right? Sometimes we say that when we introduce people, right? Oh, by the way, he doesn't have a leg. Right? Now, what does that have to do with anything? Right? Right? We say that, right? I mean, we all do this. Right? I want to introduce you to someone, she doesn't have any hair. Right? What does that matter? Right? Will you house sit my dog? He has red hair. Really? Does that make any difference? You know? Versus white hair versus black hair. I mean, think about it. It makes no difference in our pets. Does it make any difference what color skin we have? We've made it a big difference as humans. We've made it a very big difference. And so for a family that I love a lot, and for a woman that I love a lot, I did not want to have a situation where I had to pick one over the other. I wanted to have a situation where they could get to know each other and we could avoid a situation where we didn't have to pick one over the other. Now, it may never have come to that, but it could possibly. And so my advice to all of us is we should never set up our loved ones or even our coworkers. Right? We should never put ourselves in situations where we set people up. If you know people may have troubles with something, even if there may be sensitivities to something, then set up the situation for success. Set up the situation for success because we are human. The reality is, if we all had microphones on, 7x24, recording everything we all say over the last year, and we played back the worst things we've all said over the last 24 months or 12 months, we would all stand in shame. We've all said bad things. I, for one, would say, I have said bad things. And so I think it's important that we not set each other up, that we go out of our way to help those we care about, whether it's at work or at home, to ensure that we make more harmony versus hate in our society.
And I like the way you see that. We have to set each other up for success. And so when we think about the work we do, at regional, outside of regional? Are we ensuring that everyone that we work with has the opportunity to be successful? Are we building them up? Are we tearing them down? Are we building up situations? Are we tearing down situations? You know, when you were describing, oh, my friend, by the way, my friend is blind. Guess what? You know, immediately in your mind's eye, you see a blind person. You don't see the person. You immediately in your mind's eye see a blind person. And as you were using those descriptions, in my mind's eye, I was saying, oh, a bald person, a blind person, a black person, an Asian person. You start having pictures such that when you do see that person, that's what you see first. Mm-hmm. And so thank you for sharing from your heart. And so we're going to get really quickly and talk about a healthcare application. As Brent had said, stereotypical comments can be selfish, and people can make incorrect judgments. But when you take the time to get to know people, as his family did, he didn't have to pick one. So for 1 minute, really quickly, share an experience with the person you're sitting next to where you have been misjudged, or where you have misjudged someone, and how you learn from it. So a minute each. One person shares and the other person then responds by sharing, real quickly. Thank you. This is good. And the discussions don't have to stop here. This is just where the discussions start. So take these back to your departments and continue the conversation. Ask the questions. How do I categorize and label people? I'll tell you a funny story. It's been a little bit warmer, but still cool in the mornings, and I leave my house at about 5:45 a.m. for a walk. And I decided purposefully, intentionally, to start wearing my hoodie. I've had people say to me, you don't look like Sandra anymore when you have that hoodie on. What do I look like? Who do I look like? You look like we don't want to say, but maybe a thug? Where'd you get that from? And I said, the hoodie stays, because I want to break that stereotype. Good people wear hoodies when it's cold to cover their ears. And they don't want to put on a scarf and a hat. So the hoodie stays. So change the way you think. How do I feel about a person? What are my attitudes towards him or her based on religion, gender, or sexual orientation, and all of that? Do we see that individual, or do we see race, ethnicity, language, gender orientation, religion, and all of that? How do I act towards people? Now, people know when you're cold to them. We got to make a conscious effort. If we're uncomfortable, we've got to train ourselves to be comfortable. We've got to practice. We've got to work on ourselves. We've got to form good relationships so that we avoid the stereotypes, the discriminations, and prejudging people. We have to pay close attention, and we can do something to curb the negative effects of biases and stereotypes. When we work in the hospital and we hear someone say anything negative about anyone, 33% of our inpatients are Native. We've got to watch what we say. They are the biggest minority population, they're the majority of the minority. And we have to admit that we have some biases that we have to work on. We have to keep those biases in mind. I mean, you talked about biases, your stereotype towards physicians. They don't always have to be race-based or language-based or based on disability or religion or sexual orientation. It could be based on anything. I've shared my stereotype. I felt all pilots should be tall white men with a head full of hair, so that when they say, "This is your captain speaking," I know that you can fly me across the ocean. I almost fainted when a blonde, skinny lady said, "This is her captain speaking." I wanted to die. I was like, just get me off the plane. I had to confront that stereotype. I had to deal with it. Expose yourself. Yeah, that's true. True story, too. I stayed up for hours praying. And then it dawned on me that here I am with a stereotype, with a bias towards men. And Harvard has confirmed this. The IAT says 70% of people prefer tall white men. We consider them to be more competent. So I had to address my bias. And they also said that most people believe that most of us in this room, we have maybe more women than men, that we are cooks and we're cleaners. That's the stereotype. That's the bias. So be aware of these biases. So tell us a little bit more. You met your wife.
Met my wife.
And it was successful, the dates?
Yeah, after about, I think it was the 11th time I asked her to marry me, she finally said yes. And
that's a beautiful picture.
So this is our wedding photo up at the top. And this is after about 25 years. And my hair is slowly going away. And so this is my brothers and sisters here. And a lot of hair has gone away. We joke that we no longer have 4 heads, we have 8 heads and 12 heads now. But this is all of us. And I think the next picture shows, so these are us and the grandkids of my parents. And it's actually, there's about 8 or 9 more grandkids that are not here. I have my sister, Suzanne, and her husband. They have 5 kids, and they actually adopted 6 Hispanic siblings, a family of 6 whose parents both went to prison on narcotic charges, and they adopted all 6 of them. And so they have a family of 11 now. And my brother Brian and his wife Sarah lived in China for 14 years, and they have 4 kids, and they adopted a girl from China with medical problems. They live in Idaho now. They moved back to the States after 14 years. And my brother Steve, his family is in there somewhere. They've had foster kids, Hispanic foster kids in their home for a number of years, and they're adopting a young girl. So our family has become rather diverse over the years, and there's about 45 grandkids in our family now.
Your parents must be very proud. Every time working on this presentation, looking at the pictures, I thought, wow, and it all really started, as we had talked with, you introducing and, marrying someone that was very different, and then being comfortable and growing in that comfort level. And so it is so important, different based on complexion, but the same based on heart. And it's so important that we realize that. We all bleed red, and we all have the same type of heart. You have 2 sons.
Yeah, we have 2 sons, and so Stephen and Russell, these are their, when they were little boys up in the top, and just as they've gotten older over the years, and their most recent. Stephen is the oldest and the shortest, which he'll always be the shortest, and I'll always be the oldest. He's at the University of North Dakota studying math and Spanish, and plans to go to law school. And Russell, our oldest, he also served a 2-year mission in the Dominican Republic. And Russell, and so he speaks Spanish fluently, and Russell is at the School of Mines studying mechanical engineering, and he served a 2-year mission in Kentucky, so he speaks Kentuckian, and which was more difficult than Spanish to learn, and both doing extremely well. Yeah, we're very proud of them.
Before I flip to the next slide, I can see some people are just dying to ask questions, and they're looking at their wristwatch going, when will I get to ask my question? So please, questions. Yes.
Did your parents form a stereotype?
Can you say that question again?
Was there a reason that you felt like your parents might form a stereotype about Kim?
None whatsoever. I had no hint at all. But I think I was more concerned about my reaction if it happened. Actually, was my bigger concern. Because of my love for her and what I may say to them, could cause a pretty significant rift, as you can all imagine, right? And so the notion of nobody wants to lose a family over a spouse, or lose a spouse over a family, right? We want our cake and eat it too. So trying to figure out how to do that, that's really what I was trying to do. Now, that may never have happened, But if there was a 2% chance that it could happen, it was a risk I didn't want to take. And so I wanted them to get to know her as a person. And so they talked on the telephone, and they got to know her as a person. And so when the time came that they found out that she was black versus Asian or Hispanic or whatever, it was immaterial. It was immaterial because they knew her as a person.
And that speaks to a lot of things, because Dr. Kim Phillips is a dermatologist. She's a surgical, a Mohs surgeon. And when you still have to get nervous about someone who's highly accomplished, that tells you that as a society, that there are stereotypes that we really have to work on breaking, because an accomplished Mayo-trained surgical dermatologist, you still had to be careful, because maybe they had watched the movies. Now, how many of you honestly have watched the movies where, you have to kind of pause for a little bit because the thugs, again, the hoodie and the thug, where did that word come from? So you start to watch, and unconscious bias comes in based on what we see, what we watch, and the information. And so you not wanting to risk that 1%, 2% was very important, because again, when we're dealing with potential stereotypes, it transcends education. So that stereotype is something that we constantly have to work on to ensure that we don't set people up for failure. We don't want a situation where someone has watched enough movies and what they see is not the person, what they see is what they've watched. Does that make sense? That's how unconscious bias really forms a lot of the times.
I mean, this was a small town. There were no African Americans that lived in this town. I don't think my parents knew. I don't know if they'd ever had a conversation with an African American. And so their exposure to African Americans was television. And so it's hard to imagine what stereotype would be formed. There's no basis by which to form an opinion. Do you know?
I do. I would say I did not have those feelings. I grew up. Everybody was just a person. And I had dated. I never went any further
Because they had said something.
because they had said something.
So I want to say what you said loudly, because the people at the back can't hear. She said she grew up in a small town, and unfortunately her parents had said to her, and as she's talking with emotions, she said, don't you come home with a black guy. And she never formed an opinion, but they probably formed an opinion from what they had seen. And nowadays the TV programs tend to be more politically correct, but if you watch TV 10, 15, 20 years ago, different people were put in different buckets, based on race, religion, ethnicity, and everything else that we've talked about. And we tend to see people through the lens of the bucket they've been put in versus through us getting to know them. A good example is, how do we see blondes? What's the stereotype for blondes? Just say it. Yeah.
When I'm viewed at, not only my age, but being blonde,
Uh-huh.
I'm viewed as spoiled, brat, not really smart.
So she just answered it personally. And you all said it almost like a choir. When I said, how do we stereotype blondes? You all said dumb. The dumb blonde. And she's saying that's what she walked in. How do you stereotype redheads? Huh? Hotheads. How do you stereotype black women? I dare you to say it.
I'm
So
not going there.
stereotypes, they occur. They occur. I was waiting for someone to say the angry black woman. I had to just, I'm kidding. I would not fall into that. So more pictures of your family. This is a really cute picture.
That's Halloween. They don't normally dress like that.
And this is Stephen with Russell.
Yep.
And this is Dr. Kim with Stephen and Russell.
Yep.
Tell us about these pictures.
So just real quick, this is in Idaho where we grew up. We were years ago, and this is the picture on the right-hand side at the top. Our family was very active in scouting when the boys were younger, and I was an Eagle Scout. My brothers were Eagle Scouts, and Stephen and Russell were Eagle Scouts as well. And we had a trip to New York City, and when the boys were young, and this we went back to Zimbabwe where I had served my mission, and my parents, and the expressions on people's faces, because we were out with these lion cubs. This was a sanctuary where they took orphan cubs and were raising them, and one of them had growled, and so there was some interesting expressions on faces when that occurred. So
I just want to encourage us to embrace one another and have open minds to differences. Having open minds to differences can be a beautiful thing. I have friends from all over the world. Love them. People are just beautiful. New experiences open our eyes to see different colors. I talk about color in terms of being color brave and appreciating the artistic way that we've all been created and designed, and how beautiful we are, that no two human beings are the same. And so we have to open our eyes and our hearts to new experiences, because in that way we can truly, truly connect and be better together when we get to know each other and avoid those stereotypes. One of the things people tell me is, talk about the millennials, because they are seriously stereotyped. How many millennials do we have in the room? They're seriously stereotyped, and they're fighting that every day. So we've got to pay attention. Final questions for our CEO, anyone? Oh, okay, she put her hand up first, then you. Yes, go ahead. The question was, does he feel like his boys have to pick a side, a race? Do they get asked that question a lot?
that's a good question. I don't think they identify one or the other. If I was to pick, I think they identify African American more, because in our culture, if you have a little bit of pigment in your skin, you're not white, right?
The one drop rule.
I mean, that's just sort of, that's I mean, President Obama is a classic example, right? He was less than 50% African American, but he was African American. So, so that might be, but they don't really identify one way or the other. They're just people.
Yep.
That's really where they fall.
Oh, you mean Stephen? Yes.
Yeah, Stephen. Yeah, they're pretty balanced. I appreciate that. They're balanced,
Very balanced.
hardworking kids.
I have my racial kids myself.
Yeah.
I sometimes,
Yeah.
So I'll tell you something real quickly. A friend of mine, her daughter who just graduated from high school, shared this story with me 2 weeks ago, and I've said I'm going to use it. She said her mother is white and her father is black. And she said when she was growing up, people would ask her mother, because she ran a daycare, so this is for all of us to use. And they would say, why do you look the way you look, and Mr. So-and-so looks different, and so-and-so, the daughter, looks very different. And she took a dark chocolate and a white chocolate, and she said, when you put these two together, you get the milk chocolate. And that's how she explained it to the kids, and the kids were fine. They never asked questions again. And I said to this lady, I'm going to use that. So now I'm using it, and I want you guys to come up with ways to explain this to children so that they understand. You had a question before we go. How did her wife's, Dr. Kim Phillips' family feel about them dating?
So Kim's grandmother, when she met me, she shared with Kim's mother that she thought I was a really nice young man, and said I was a rich white boy, and that Kim should get a hold of me. She had no clue I was the poorest kid on the block. No, honestly, Kim's mother is the sweetest woman, absolutely the sweetest woman. So it's been absolutely fantastic. No problems, no issues at all. Yeah.
One final question. Our time is up. One final question. Anyone?
I would say that Kim's family, Kim's the youngest of four, Kim's parents raised her brothers and sisters, their family, as your focus needs to be on being a great citizen, a great mother, a great father, a great brother, a great sister, a great neighbor, a great friend, and almost your last focus needs to be on your race. That's how you fit into a community. If you wear your race as the first and expect entitlement or special treatment because of the color of your skin, you have it backwards. And I think that's some pretty good advice. That it is about what we can do to benefit society. What am I doing to help my neighbor, my friend, my brother, my sister? Right? What can I do as service? Am I my brother's keeper? And sometimes we can do a little because we don't have much, and sometimes we can do a lot because we've been blessed. Regardless of the color of our skin. And if we all did that, we would be a much better place, regardless of the color of our skin. And then people would look past the color of our skin. When we lead with the color of our skin, I think that's when we get ourselves in trouble as people. That's my own personal.
And I know she doesn't want me to mention she's in the room, but please forgive me, I will. Dr. Kim Phillips is in the room, so if you want to talk to her afterwards, you want to stand up for a second and wave? Sometimes it's hard for one spouse to talk while the other is in the room. And I'll tell you real quickly, I did something with med staff one time, and I said, if you would save your wife, your mother, or your kids, pick a side. All the medical staff went to their children's side because they'd save their kids. And as they were going towards that side, they were saying, my spouse would want me to save my kid too. My husband was the sole one who would save his spouse. They tried to pull him to the other side. And I said, don't you realize I'm in front of the room? He better stay as a Lone Ranger, claiming that he would save his spouse. And so it is sometimes, it's not always easy to have your spouse in the room. But this has been very easy, and this has been very good. And I just wanted to mention her name. She's a wonderful dermatologist at 5th Street Clinic. And so maybe she'll linger for a minute, and you can just shake her hand and talk to her as well. I'm putting her on the spot, giving you work. I hope you don't have patients at 1 o'clock, sorry. But thank you so much. Do you have any closing remarks you want to say?
Thank you all for what you do every day. Thank you.
He will linger and he will stay behind. He'll talk to you for a while. We do not have a gathering in June as we try to wrap up our fiscal year. We will reconvene in July. So thank you so much for coming.